Nancy's in Hawaii.
Aloha, Nancy.
Maybe just hello. Hello. All right. Well, as well, that could so now that we got that going, and Alyssa is, you know, on brand, frantically coming from another meeting. So, but she said to definitely get started because we want to give Agus as much time as he needs, and we're all really excited. So it is my great pleasure to introduce Agus Surachman, who is a postdoc here in the Center for Health and Community and has been working with Alyssa and Barbara Laraya, who we all know at UC Berkeley. Agus got his PhD in Human Development and Family Studies from Penn State University, where he did great work with the likes of David Almeida, who's a friend of the program. Prior to that, got a master's in Human Development and Family Studies from Purdue University Northwest. And he is really such a joy to have in our group. I mean, not just kind of your intellect, but also kind of your energy and your presence. It really is. It has been such an honor to have you present and be interacting with our various research nodes. And so, you know, we are really excited about all the things that you got going on. We're excited to hear about your work. And certainly not surprised, but of course, enthusiastically excited about your next steps in taking a faculty position in wherever that might be, where they're lucky to get you. So with that, Agus, you want to share your screen and do your thing?
Sure.
Awesome. I'm actually, oh, is it recording? Who did you do that? Who did that? Elena, thank you. You're so good. All right, perfect. This will end up, if it's okay, Agus, if we were gonna, we usually put these up on our YouTube channel. So yeah, but if not, we can always edit it.
We edit out the initial discussion.
Yeah, I always edit it out.
Yeah. Thank you, Nikki.
Right.
Yes, yes.
Can you see my slides?
You're so wise. All right, yes, we can see your slides okay. And we're ready to go. So go ahead. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Eric. That's a very generous introduction. I'm really honored to be here, and thank you everyone for joining. Apologies to some people who have listened to this presentation because I practiced before at WIP. But for those of you who are here for the first time listening to some of my work that I've done, I'm going to present those. And my work, generally speaking, looks at the association between life course socioeconomic status and health. So briefly, my identity, I guess, is I'm a developmental scientist, but I'm also a health disparity scientist. I'm interested in understanding the intersectionality between life course socioeconomic status and minoritized identity, especially race, on creating health disparities through the major biopsychosocial pathways, mostly looking at the stress process and also the accelerated aging as a major biological pathway. In today's presentation, I'm going to highlight some of my works that focus on accelerated aging or accelerated deterioration of integrity across multiple physiological systems that has been shown to be associated with premature morbidity and mortality. And my work specifically looking at accelerated aging through the lens of accelerated renal aging, inflammaging, and also epigenetic aging. And my research examined the role of life course socioeconomic status as a critical socioeconomic context of accelerated aging. Now, when we talk about socioeconomic status in the context of the United States, it's important to consider the well-established evidence of racial differences in socioeconomic status between white and non-white individuals as a group. And these differences across different racial groups should be considered as the impact of systemic racism that limit the opportunities for non-white individuals to be included in the mainstream structure and eventually limit their ability to accumulate socioeconomic status across the life course. Now, it's also important to consider that the impact of systemic racism on disparities in health is also work through the racial disparities in non-socioeconomic status related factors. And the one that I will highlight in my work is especially looking at the role of discrimination. And when we talk about life course socioeconomic status and how that may play a role on disparities in health, there are 3 different frameworks that we can look at life course socioeconomic status. The first one is known as the sensitive period framework, looking at the direct association between early life socioeconomic status on adult health. The second framework is known as the accumulation framework, looking at how socioeconomic status differences early in life may accumulate across the life course and leads to disparities in health. And finally, the third framework is known as the mobility framework, looking at how different characteristics of socioeconomic status mobility may link differently to health outcomes. And in today's presentation, I will highlight the reasoning and the assumptions behind these 3 frameworks using the 2 studies that I've done. The first study highlights the sensitive period and the accumulation framework by looking at the association between parental education and disparities in adult kidney function. The second study focuses on the mobility framework by testing the association between socioeconomic status mobility and disparities in adult inflammation. And finally, I will end my presentation by arguing that our current perspective on looking at the social determinants of health and the developmental origin of health through the life course framework is quite limited and needs to be expanded by looking at the intergenerational transmission of social disadvantage. Now I will move on to my first study, looking at the association between parental education and adult kidney functioning among Black and white American adults. I would like to start by providing a brief explanation about kidney function for those of you who are not familiar. So the human kidneys play important roles on maintaining physiological homeostasis through the following functions. And kidney fulfill this function through blood filtration from and back to the circulation. And the functional unit of blood filtration in the kidneys is known as nephron, and the specific part of nephron that filters blood is known as glomerulus. So the measure for kidney function is known as glomerular filtration rate, or GFR. Among healthy adults, GFR ranges from 90 to 120 milliliter per minute. And as part of normal aging process, our kidney function declines across adulthood. And for some individuals, the rate of decline in kidney function is faster and may lead to the development of chronic kidney disease, or the umbrella term for various disorders associated with a progressive decline in kidney function, mostly due to damage in the kidney physiology. And chronic kidney disease is currently a public health problem in the United States. Around 15% of adults in the US were expected to experience chronic kidney disease at some point in their life. And according to the Healthy People 2030, the blueprint of public health policy in the United States, one of the goals is to reduce the burden of chronic kidney disease and its risk factors. However, one of the most important challenge to achieve this goal is the persistent socioeconomic and racial disparities in chronic kidney disease. Now, in my work, I argue that progressive decline in kidney function as a marker of chronic kidney disease should be appreciated through the lens of the lifespan development to better understand the development of the disease. Now, the blue line here represents the trajectories of relatively healthy individual. So kidney function is lower in early life and it reaches its peak in early adulthood, and then it continuously declines across adulthood. Now compare the blue line to the orange line here that represent kidney function trajectory of someone that developed chronic kidney disease. So the development of the disease is usually preceded by the stage of hyperfiltration that is followed by faster age-related decline and end up in the stage of hypofiltration and the onset of the disease. And my work tried to examine this nuance of differences between healthy and unhealthy individuals in terms of their kidney functioning across adulthood, especially among those who have not yet developed chronic kidney disease. Now, from the lifespan development perspective, we know that early life is a sensitive period that links to the development and trajectories of kidney function across adulthood. There is a well-established evidence that renal programming early in life through nephron endowment and also physiological dysregulation is associated with the propensity of developing chronic kidney disease in adulthood. In addition to that, exposure to health-related risk factors across the lifespan, such as metabolic syndrome and hypertension, is also associated with the trajectories of kidney function across adulthood and the probability of developing chronic kidney disease. And this early life and life course factors can be considered as the multi-hit factors that are associated with age-related decline in kidney function across adulthood. The goal of this study was to contextualize these multi-hit factors by looking at the important role of life course socioeconomic status. First, we know that early life socioeconomic status is an important social factor of early rearing that has been shown to be associated with multiple indicators associated with renal programming, including low birth weight, small for gestational age, prematurity, and also higher psychosocial stressors. Multiple studies have also demonstrated that there's direct association between early life socioeconomic status and the development of health-related risk factors associated with kidney disease in adulthood. And finally, adult socioeconomic status such as income and education has been implicated on the development of health-related risk factors as well, such as obesity, hypertension, and diabetes. And together, early life socioeconomic status and adult socioeconomic status are linked to each other, forming what is known as the life course socioeconomic status. Now, there is lack of understanding regarding the role of race on the association between life course socioeconomic status and age-related decrements in kidney function across adulthood. There are two major hypotheses on how race may play a role in this association. It's whether race interactively or additively associated with socioeconomic status on influencing health-related risk factors, on influencing kidney functioning across adulthood. The goal of the current analysis were three. First, guided by the sensitive period framework, the study examined whether parental education as the socioeconomic context of early rearing was associated with age-related decrements in kidney function across adulthood. The second goal was to test whether the influence of parental education and race on age-related decrements in kidney function followed the interactive, meaning that the association between parental education and kidney functioning was conditional on race, or the additive pattern, meaning that both parental education and race independently associated with age-related decrements in kidney function. And the final goal was to examine the life course pathways from parental education to age-related decrements in kidney function across adulthood through current socioeconomic status and health-related risk factors as a way to examine the impact of Life Course SES accumulation, and also to test whether there are racial differences on these life course pathways. The data for this specific analysis were from the Midlife in the United States, or MIDAS study, a national study of health and well-being among middle and older adults in the United States. MIDAS was started in 1995, and the follow-up studies were conducted in 2004 and also 2013. And in 2011, a new sample was recruited to replenish the original MIDAS sample and also to examine the impact of the Great Recession on health and well-being in the United States. And the current analysis included data from MIDAS 2 and MIDAS Refresher, and the analytic sample included participants who participated in the biomarker project and also included the Milwaukee oversample to increase the proportion of Black participants in the MIDAS study. The analytic sample included more than 1,800 individuals, majority of them self-identified as non-Hispanic white. A little bit about the biomarker project in the MIDAS study. So subsample of MIDAS participants were invited to stay overnight in one of the clinical research units that are located in the East Coast, Midwest, and the West Coast. And then fasting blood and urine sample were collected in the morning of this day. And the marker of kidney function were from the fasting blood sample during collected during the biomarker project. Parental education was divided into lower and higher based on whether their parents achieve high school degree or not. And the current socioeconomic status was a composite score based on education, income, and other indicators of socioeconomic status, such as financial well-being and financial strength. 3 health-related risk factors were included in the analysis, including obesity status, elevated blood pressure, and also insulin resistance. And kidney function was based on serum creatinine was calculated using CKD EPI formula. To test the association between parental education, race, and age-related decrements in eGFR, we use multiple linear regression analysis, and we utilize regression-based moderated mediation analysis to examine the life course pathways and racial differences in life course pathways from parental education to age-related decrements in kidney function across adulthood. We found that lower parental education was associated with steeper age-related decrements in eGFR. As shown in the graph here, the y-axis represent eGFR or kidney function, and the x-axis represent age of the participants divided into younger and older. Similarly, we also found that race was associated with age-related decrements in eGFR. Black participants, especially shown steeper age-related decrements in eGFR relative to white participants. And as you can see on the graph here, the steeper age-related decrement in eGFR among Black adults was especially driven by the indication of hyperfiltration among younger Black participants. However, we found that the association between parental education and age-related decrements in eGFR was not conditional on race. So parental education and race linked to adult kidney functioning in an additive rather than interactive pattern. Now I will show you the finding from the life course pathway separately among white and Black participants. I will start with the findings among white participants. We found that parental education was associated with current socioeconomic status, and both parental education and current socioeconomic status were associated with health-related risk factors, especially insulin resistance and elevated blood pressure. And finally, insulin resistance and elevated blood pressure were associated with age-related decrements in eGFR. So the life course pathways among white adults followed the hypothesized model that I presented earlier. However, among Black adults, we found that parental education was not associated with current socioeconomic status. However, parental education was directly associated with one health-related risk factors, that is insulin resistance, and current socioeconomic status was not associated with insulin resistance. And we found that insulin resistance was associated with age-related decrements in eGFR among Black adults. Closer examination on the indirect effect from parental education to age-related decrements in eGFR through insulin resistance among Black adults was shown that it was only significant among younger Black adults. This indicates that younger Black adults with lower parental education and insulin resistance were especially at risk for hyperfiltration. This study highlights the importance of early life socioeconomic status as a sensitive early life as a sensitive period of adult kidney functioning. Parental education is an important socioeconomic context of early life, and lower parental education was linked to steeper age-related decrements in EGFR across adulthood. And this analysis also showed that the link between parental education and race followed the additive pattern instead of the interactive pattern, meaning that both race and socioeconomic status were independently associated with kidney functioning across adulthood. Some other studies have shown that, for example, discrimination may be a better indicator of race, and it's been shown that higher discrimination was associated with lower EGFR among adults in the United States, independent of socioeconomic status. We also demonstrated that there's racial differences in life course pathways from parental education to adult kidney functioning. And we found that insulin resistance was an important health-related risk factor, especially for younger Black participants, that may lead to renal hyperfiltration. And we know from multiple studies that renal hyperfiltration is a well-established risk factor for the development of chronic kidney disease in adulthood. And we know that there is a raise in the prevalence of diabetes among younger Black individuals in the United States. And this should be a warning for its dire consequences on increasing the prevalence of diabetic nephropathy, which is the leading cause of chronic kidney disease in the United States. Now I will move on to the second study, looking at the association between socioeconomic status, mobility, daily discrimination, and inflammation. In the previous study, I've shown that lower childhood socioeconomic status indicated by lower parental education was associated with steeper age-related decrements in EGFR across adulthood. In my works, I've also shown that childhood socioeconomic status, independent of adult socioeconomic status, was associated with other indicators of health and well-being, including worse cardiometabolic health in adulthood, faster increase in metabolic syndrome severity from childhood to early midlife, and also worse psychological indicators, such as daily stress and well-being in adulthood. Now, if early life SES is important for adult health, can upward mobility mitigate the negative impact of growing up in lower socioeconomic environment? I think that is an important question to be answered. And in order to answer that question, I specifically look at inflammaging or chronic low-grade inflammation that is known to be a robust biological mechanism that link lower socioeconomic status to multiple chronic disease, such as cardiovascular disease, diabetes, kidney disease, and also Alzheimer's disease. And multiple studies have demonstrated that early life socioeconomic status, independent of adult socioeconomic status, is associated with inflammation across adulthood. However, there's lack of understanding whether socioeconomic status mobility is associated with adult inflammation and whether there's a benefit of experiencing upward socioeconomic status mobility on mitigating some of the negative impact of growing up in lower socioeconomic status environment. However, some studies have demonstrated that there is an equal health benefit of experiencing upward mobility. There's this idea of the diminishing return of upward mobility, especially for non-white individuals. And multiple studies have shown that younger Black adults who achieve higher levels of education despite growing up in lower SES environment is actually having lower worse physiological indicators compared to other individuals from different racial groups. And this phenomenon is known as skin deep resilience. And one of the hypotheses of what's driving this skin deep resilience is that in order for Black youth to achieve higher levels of education despite socioeconomic disadvantage background is that they have to maintain high level of self-control and to persist with effort to achieve this achievement of having higher education. Now, we also know that there is well-established evidence of racial disparities in inflammation between Black and white individuals. And this disparities is mostly partially explained by differences in socioeconomic status between these two racial groups. However, we haven't really explored the role of non-socioeconomic status related factors, especially discrimination, on whether discrimination can explain some of this racial disparities in inflammation across adulthood between Black and non-Black individuals. Early evidence have shown that higher daily discrimination was associated with higher inflammation among Black adults. However, we don't know whether this association is independent of socioeconomic status mobility. And that's the goal of the current study, that we would love to examine the independent effect of both SES mobility and discrimination on adult inflammation. Now, a little bit about this study, we also tried to combine the objective and subjective indicators of socioeconomic status when looking at SES mobility. So in the past, majority of works on SES mobility has been done by looking at income dynamics or educational mobility, and did not include the role of subjective socioeconomic status on this analysis of SES mobility. We know that SES mobility is a different construct than objective socioeconomic status. We know that subjective SES is a different construct than objective socioeconomic status. And it's been shown that subjective SES, independent of objective SES, is predictive of multiple health outcomes. And we also know that there's racial differences in subjective SES. Despite having lower income and education, Black adults tend to rate their subjective SES higher compared to white adults. So when we combine both objective and subjective SES, we may see some differences in terms of SES mobility patterns between Black and white adults. So the goal of the current analysis were two. The first goal was to identify SES mobility based on both objective and subjective indicators of socioeconomic status. And the goal was to examine whether there's racial differences between Black and white adults in terms of their SES mobility pattern. And the second goal was to examine the association between SES mobility, discrimination, and inflammation. We're especially interested to see whether there's benefit of experiencing upward mobility on our adult inflammation, and whether there's an independent role of discrimination on influencing our adult inflammation, independent of SES mobility. The data for this analysis also come from the midlife in the United States, or MIDAS. We use specifically data from the second wave of MIDAS. And the analytic sample of this study included 1,200 participants that also participated in the biomarker assessment from which the data of inflammation were collected. Majority of the participants self-identified as non-Hispanic white. These are the measures of socioeconomic status across the life course, included both objective and subjective measures. So measures such as income and education were considered as objective measures, while measures such as financial well-being or financial strain were considered as subjective measures of socioeconomic status. Daily discrimination was measured using everyday discrimination scale that was developed by David Williams and colleagues. And two markers of inflammation were included in the analysis, C-reactive protein and also fibrinogen. We use latent class analysis, or LCA, to identify SES mobility based on 7 indicators of objective and subjective socioeconomic status across the life course. So a little bit about LCA. It's a person-centered analysis. They aim to group individuals based on multiple categorical indicators. Some strengths of LCA include that it's a more objective data-driven process of looking at the heterogeneity of individuals based on categorical data. And also LCA provides parsimonious and interpretable solutions in terms of grouping of individuals based on categorical indicators. So we initially analyzed SES mobility using all the participants, and we found that the 4-group SES mobility was the best fitting model. However, we found that there was severe violation of measurement invariance based on race, meaning that this 4-group of SES mobility was not applicable to both racial groups. Hence, we re-identify SES mobility separately for Black and white groups. And we found that the best fitting model for the Black group was the 3-group SES mobility model, while the best fitting model for the white group was the 4-group SES mobility model. Here are the SES mobility groups for Black adults. Majority of them were grouped into the stable low group, and the second group was labeled as downwardly mobile, and the last group was upwardly mobile. And here are the SES mobility groups among white adults: stable low, similar to the Black adults group, and also subjectively downward, upwardly mobile, and finally the largest group among white adults was stable high. I will briefly explain the characteristic of each SES mobility group for both Black and white groups. We will start with the SES mobility among Black adults. The first group was stable low, characterized by having low SES, both objective and subjective SES across the life course, and it was the largest among Black group. The second group was downwardly mobile, characterized by higher objective and subjective childhood SES, but low objective and subjective SES across adulthood. The third group of the final group was upwardly mobile, characterized by lower objective and subjective childhood SES, but higher objective and subjective adult SES. Now, the first group among white adult was stable low, which was the smallest among white group, characterized by having low SES, both objective and subjective SES across the life course. The second group was subjectively downward, characterized by higher SES across the life course, both objective and subjective, except for the subjective adult SES. The third group was upwardly mobile, characterized by lower objective and subjective childhood SES, but higher objective and subjective adult SES. And finally, the largest group among white adults was the stable high group, characterized by high objective and subjective SES across the life course. First, we wanted to see whether daily discrimination was associated with SES mobility. We found that SES mobility was not associated with daily discrimination among Black adults. As you can see, those who experience upward mobility, they reported higher daily discrimination compared to the stable low group. However, we found that daily discrimination was associated with SES mobility among white group, meaning that differences in daily discrimination was counted by differences in SES among white, but not among Black group. Now, when we look at the association between SES mobility, daily discrimination, and inflammation among Black adults, we found that those in the upwardly mobile group showed non-significant difference in terms of their inflammation compared to the stable low or the downwardly mobile group, meaning that SES mobility was not associated with inflammation in adulthood. However, we found that there is association between daily discrimination and inflammation among Black group. Now move on to the finding among white group. we found that those in the upwardly mobile group showed significantly lower CRP and fibrinogen compared to the stable low group. However, daily discrimination was not associated with CRP and fibrinogen among white group. So this study highlights racial differences in SES mobility between Black and white adults. Largest proportion of Black adults were grouped into the stable low group, while the largest group among white adults was the stable high group. And we found that there is diminishing return of experiencing upward mobility among Black adults. And we also found that there is association between daily discrimination and inflammation, but only among Black adults. And this association was independent of SES mobility. And this lack of socioeconomic status combined with high daily discrimination among Black groups may be a better context of why there is racial disparities in inflammation between Black relative to white adults. Now I would like to move on to the final study. It's a work in progress that I've been working on here at UCSF, looking at epigenetic intergenerational transmission of social disadvantage by focusing on examining whether grandparents' education was associated with grandchildren epigenetic age. Using the two different studies, I have demonstrated the importance of early life socioeconomic context on adult health disparities directly or through life course accumulation or through mobility. While this approach was helpful, it is now considered insufficient in order to really understand the etiology of health disparities. Because we know that there is emerging evidence of epigenetic intergenerational transmission of social disadvantage in humans. For example, studies involving experience of severe stressful, such as studies among survivor of Holocaust or Tutsi genocide, has been shown the evidence of epigenetic intergenerational transmission due to this exposure to a stressful experience. And based on these studies, it's hypothesized that this transmission process was associated with methylation of genes responsible for immune-related genes. And given these findings, it is important, I think, to consider that the critical or sensitive period of the development of health may not necessarily is our early life, but it could also happen before the conception, meaning, for example, our parents' early life experience may have direct impact on our development of health right now. So the question is whether there is evidence of intergenerational transmission and health in human. And if there is evidence of intergenerational transmission of health in human, this may have a huge implication on the way we conceptualize health disparities and the way we conceptualize the developmental origin of health and disease across adulthood. So the goal of this work was to examine the association between grandparents' educational attainment and grandchildren's epigenetic age, and whether this association was mediated by mother's life course factors. We know from multiple studies that grandparents' educational attainment provide socioeconomic context of a mother's early life. Some studies have shown the association between low childhood socioeconomic status and DNA methylation among genes that are responsible for inflammation regulation. And this biological embedding of early life socioeconomic status may also have long-term effect on mother's inflammation in adulthood. And in addition to the importance of early life factors, It's also important to consider the influence of life course factors, such as health-related factors that I've talked in previous studies before. And the main question is how this epigenetic marker transmitted into the next generation. And one hypothesis is through the in utero process. And multiple studies have shown that maternal early life stress instead of pregnancy stress, for example, is more important on changing the placental environment that may have significant impact on fetal development and epigenetic change that may mimic the maternal epigenetic that happen in their early life. So to reiterate, the goal of the current analysis was to test the association between educational attainment and grandchildren's epigenetic clock. And second, to examine whether this association was mediated by mother's life course factors, including BMI trajectories across childhood, adult behavioral factors, and also adult inflammation. So for this analysis, data were from the National Growth and Health Study, or NGHS. The original NGHS was conducted by the NHLBI. It was aimed to examine the etiology and development of obesity and metabolic health by recruiting Black and white girls aged 9 to 10, recruited from multiple areas across the United States, and they were followed annually for 10 consecutive years. And in 2016, these participants were recruited to the National Growth and Health Study, especially those who resided in the Bay Area, and now they're in their midlife, and their youngest child were also recruited to this study. So in general, we have 3-generation data involving the grandparents, the mothers, and also the grandchildren. For this specific analysis, data, the analytic sample included 241 grandchildren with available aging clock information. They were 2 to 17 years old, and the mean age for this participant was 8 years old. Grandparents' educational attainment was reported during girls' recruitment to the original study conducted by the NHLBI, and it was divided into whether they achieve college degree or no college degree. And the main outcome of this analysis was grandchildren's epigenetic clock, and it was based on saliva that was collected in the lab, and it was calculated using the Horvath method. And the DNA methylation age acceleration in general represent the discrepancies between our biological age to our chronological age. Here's some of the early finding from this analysis. Here, on the y-axis here, it represents the age and sex adjusted Horvath DNA methylation age acceleration in years, or the discrepancies between biological age and chronological age. And the y-axis here represent, the x-axis here represent grandparents' educational attainment. And there's significant difference in DNA methylation age acceleration based on grandparents' educational attainment. As you can see, grandchildren with lower grandparents' education, their biological age is identical to their chronological age. However, among grandchildren with higher grandparents' education, their biological age was almost half year slower than their chronological age. Early analysis indicated that this association was mediated by mother's life course factor, especially mother's educational attainment, mother's adult health behavior, and also mother's adult inflammation. Now, I would like to end this presentation by talking about some of the future direction that I would like to pursue. There are two major line of research that I would like to pursue in the next 5 years. So the first one, I label it Rethinking Psychonephrology. And the second line of research focuses on intergenerational transmission of health. So now I would like to talk a little bit about psychonephrology. So the current definition of psychonephrology is it's a subfield of nephrology that focuses on psychological and social factors that affect people living with the physical burden of having chronic kidney disease. However, this definition is quite narrow given our understanding that the life course factors of chronic kidney disease involve environmental, nutritional, also psychological factors across the life course that may have some impact on our kidney functioning across adulthood and also the development of chronic kidney disease. So in the next 5 years, I would love to continue this line of research by focusing on life course biopsychosocial factors of kidney functioning across adulthood. For example, by focusing on the role of life course SES and kidney functioning across adulthood, looking at the role of SES mobility and also subjective socioeconomic status. In addition to that, I would love to also focus on understanding the role of psychosocial stressors, such as daily stress, and how that may have role on our kidney functioning across adulthood. I would love to also examine the important role of environmental and community level factors, such as exposure to harmful environment at work, and also neighborhood social context and how that may play a role on the development of chronic kidney disease. And finally, looking at important biological factors that are known to be implicated in the development of chronic kidney disease, such as inflammation in adulthood. Here are some work in progress looking at the role of life course SES and kidney functioning across adulthood. In one analysis, I look at how educational mobility across generation may be associated with kidney functioning across adulthood and how this association may be moderated by race. I also look at different construct of subjective socioeconomic status, looking at the role of subjective social status, financial strain, and financial well-being, and how they may play a role on our kidney functioning across adulthood. So the second major line of research is by focusing on intergenerational transmission of health. Building on my current work, I would love to look closer on the epigenetic mechanisms that may be involved in the intergenerational transmission of health by focusing on looking at the methylation of genes implicated in intergenerational transmission. For example, genes associated with glucocorticoid regulation and also regulation of inflammation has been hypothesized to be important in the process of intergenerational transmission of health. Also looking closer into the in utero processes, looking at maternal childhood and life course factors and how that may play a role in the in utero processes and the transmission process to the offspring. And finally, looking at modifiable factors across the life course, such as lifestyle factors that may be able to be considered as factors that can be intervened to cut this cycle of intergenerational transmission of health. And building on my current work, looking at the intersectionality between socioeconomic status and race, I think it's important to really carefully conceptualize the idea of social disadvantage that may play a role on the transmission process across generation. I would like to end my presentation by acknowledging the funding sources for me during working on these projects, and also for the MIDAS study and for the NGHS study. And also I would like to acknowledge my collaborators for all this work. And thank you for listening, and I would love to hear your questions or feedback.